It is late in Paris, the kind of late when even the river seems to hold its breath, and the stones beneath your feet feel older than memory itself. Inside the thick gray walls of the conciergerie, where footsteps echo like distant thunder, a quiet figure waits, once feared, once admired, now wrapped in the hush that comes before an ending. His name is Maximilien Robespierre, and tonight, in the dim candlelight of a prison cell, the man who shaped a revolution sits in stillness, as if listening to the city he once commanded. And perhaps, somewhere in the cool Paris air, the city listens back. The conciergerie was not known for comfort. If anything, it had the charm of a damp basement storage room where someone forgot to store anything except despair. The walls were heavy with moisture, the floors uneven, and the draft from the river seemed determined to remind every prisoner that Paris nights could be cold in more ways than one. Yet in this place, so close to the Seine that you could almost hear the ripples brushing the banks, Robespierre now waited for dawn, a dawn that promised no fresh beginning. He had once been called the Incorruptible, a title that sounded noble, slightly intimidating, and possibly like the name of a summer blockbuster. It meant that people believed he could not be bribed, swayed, or softened by power. Ironically, by this final night, the title seemed to hover around him like an echo from a distant time, a reminder of a younger man who had spoken bravely about justice and equality. Now those ideals sat beside him like quiet companions, and perhaps even they were not sure what he had become. Paris outside the prison walls had grown used to change. Over the past years, the city had watched kings fall, crowds surge, and politics swing back and forth like an overheated pendulum. Markets opened with uncertainty. Citizens whispered in cafes, and official notices posted on street corners seemed to multiply as fast as the rumors they inspired. Through all of this, Robespierre's voice had once carried above the noise. He had stood in assembly halls with his precise posture and steady gaze, shaping laws with words sharp enough to cut yet measured, as if weighed in the palm of his hand. That same voice was silent now, partly due to injury, partly due to the inevitability of the moment. In the slow hours before morning, Robespierre must have sensed that the revolution he helped direct had taken a turn he could no longer guide. He had risen from obscurity, a quiet lawyer from Arras, and become one of the most recognized figures in the movement that reshaped France. But revolutions, especially lively French ones, rarely moved in straight lines. The people who once cheered him had grown wary over time, whispering that perhaps he'd become too strict, too rigid, too convinced that his path was the only one, and so he found himself here, in a stone cell that smelled faintly of damp straw and fading ambition. The guards outside moved with a practiced rhythm, the sort that comes from long hours and repeated routines. To them, this was just another prisoner headed toward the guillotine, though perhaps they exchanged glances out of curiosity. It was not every day that someone who had once guided the fate of France waited quietly in the dark, preparing to meet the machine that had become an unmistakable symbol of the age. Robespierre himself, even in this final stretch, seemed composed, not serene exactly, but settled, as though he had finally stepped outside the swirl of debates, speeches, and arguments that had consumed the previous years. The conciergerie had a way of stripping life down to its barest essentials. Here, there were no crowds, no assemblies, no urgent whispers of political maneuvering. There were only stone walls, the faint scent of river air drifting through the bars, and the knowledge that morning would bring an ending he could not rewrite. And so the night stretched on, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the slow, careful manner of a chapter closing itself. Outside, the river kept flowing. Inside, Robespierre waited, a quiet figure in a quiet cell, marking the final hours of a life intertwined with one of history's great upheavals. It was the last calm before the final step onto the scaffold, and in its stillness the story of the French Revolution seemed to gather itself, preparing to unfold from its beginning. A royal wedding and the first cracks in the kingdom. 1770 to 1774. If you were to wander into Versailles in the early 1770s, you might think you had walked straight into a living postcard, the kind printed with shimmering gold edges, and a note that says, "Wish you were here, but only if you behave perfectly." The air smelled faintly of polished marble and powdered wigs, and somewhere in the distance an orchestra always seemed to be warming up, even if no one had hired them. Versailles was a place where nothing happened quietly, including weddings, and certainly not the wedding of a future king. On a spring day in 1770, the palace overflowed with decorations, perfume, and people who all tried their best to appear natural while actually elbowing one another for the best view. The occasion was the marriage of the young Dauphin, Louis, to Marie Antoinette, the charming teenage archduchess from Austria. They were both very young, both very polite, and both perhaps secretly wishing for a bit more guidance on what exactly they were supposed to do next, aside from looking regal. Louis was 15, soft-spoken, slightly plump, and marched through social events the way someone might walk across a frozen pond, carefully, quietly, and hoping no one would notice how unsure he felt. Marie Antoinette, a year younger, arrived with bright eyes and an energy that made courtiers whisper that she might bring fresh life to Versailles. She also brought an entire diplomatic alliance neatly wrapped into her presence, the kind of political gift that monarchies loved even more than diamonds. As the ceremony unfolded with all the grandeur one would expect from a palace that practically specialized in grandeur, people whispered about how lovely the couple looked together. The orchestra played, the candles burned gracefully, the courtiers fanned themselves dramatically, and in the midst of it all, Louis and Marie Antoinette entered marriage with the soft uncertainty of two teenagers asked to portray the leading roles in a play they had never rehearsed. Life at Versailles was a spectacle even on an ordinary Tuesday, so during a royal wedding, it became something close to theatrical overload. You could hardly take a step without stumbling into a powdered wig, a velvet curtain, or a servant whose job seemed to be carrying a tray of pastries that no one was entirely sure they were supposed to eat. The palace glowed with endless rooms, long hallways and mirrors, positioned to multiply both the light and the vanity of its inhabitants. Marie Antoinette tried her best to adjust. She learned to curtsy at the right depth, to smile for the right amount of time, and to glide rather than walk, as if the floor were a frozen lake, and she'd become a figure skater without being informed. Yet behind the sparkling details and cheerful music, the young bride was still a girl far from home, surrounded by customs that felt both fascinating and exhausting. Louis, meanwhile, preferred quieter things. He liked locks, gears, and mechanical puzzles. He could be found examining a piece of metalwork, with intense concentration, attempting to solve its mystery, while the court swirled around him in silk and gossip. He was kind, gentle, and undeniably awkward, and in a palace that demanded perfection, those qualities made him charming to some and perplexing to others. Despite the festivities, the marriage began with a complicated pause. The court, which believed it had the right to comment on absolutely everything, noticed that the royal couple did not seem in a rush to produce an heir. Days passed, weeks passed, then years. Whispers floated through the hallways, like little birds carrying tiny pieces of scandal. People speculated, gossiped, and invented entire stories to fill the silence where royal news should have been. Marie Antoinette, already adjusting to a new country, found herself under a magnifying glass she had never asked for. The absence of a child became a sort of public puzzle discussed over wine at dinner parties and anywhere two or more courtiers gathered with free time and opinions. Meanwhile, Louis continued to study locks, probably unaware that the entire court was studying him. Beyond the palace, however, France faced realities far less glamorous than the latest hairstyle trend, or yet another banquet. The country had been financially drained after years of costly wars, particularly one disastrous conflict in North America. Fields in the countryside struggled, some harvests faltered, and the economic weight upon ordinary families grew heavier each year. But Versailles remained wrapped in a cocoon of glittering comfort, protected by distance, privilege, and an impressive supply of pastries. Inside those walls, the idea that France might be drifting toward trouble felt remote. The chandeliers still sparkled beautifully, the garden still stretched out in perfect symmetry, and the royal family continued its routines as though the kingdom beyond the gates existed mostly as a scenic backdrop. Still, even Versailles could not hide everything. Every now and then, a letter or report would arrive hinting that unrest simmered among the people, that prices were rising, or that the burden of taxes weighed unfairly on the poorest citizens. But such concerns seemed distant, almost abstract, like hearing that a storm might appear someday far on the horizon. For now, the sun still shone on the palace, and life moved with graceful ceremony. In this world of glittering routines, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette grew into their roles slowly, carefully, and sometimes uneasily. They attended ceremonies, learned court etiquette, and attempted to balance the expectations pressed upon them. Yet beneath the polite smiles and elaborate costumes, the foundation of their kingdom was gradually shifting. Marie Antoinette, with her natural charm and taste for fashionable amusements, became a frequent topic of conversation. She enjoyed music, parties, and especially elaborate hairstyles that seemed to grow taller with each passing season. Courtiers admired her style, though some quietly questioned whether such extravagance was entirely appropriate at a time when the kingdom was short on money. Whispered judgments traveled quickly, as they always did in Versailles, moving faster than any official news. Louis, well-meaning but hesitant, struggled to assert authority. Important decisions were difficult for him, and he often looked to advisors for guidance. Yet advisors changed frequently, politics shifted unpredictably, and the pressure of ruling a troubled nation fell more heavily upon his shoulders as the years passed. Thus, between 1770 and 1774, while Versailles glowed with celebration, France quietly edged closer to instability. The The royal marriage had been meant to symbolize unity, strength, and the promise of a prosperous future. Instead, it became the first chapter of a story far more complex than anyone at that wedding banquet could have guessed. And so the tale moves forward from shimmering halls and soft candlelight into a world that would grow louder, heavier, and more determined in its need for change. But for now, in these early years, nothing seemed urgent. Everything felt suspended in time. The palace continued shining, the music continued playing, and somewhere in the distance the first faint rumble of the coming revolution whispered its arrival, too soft, yet for anyone to hear. A young king, a growing debt, and the rise of new ideas. 1774 to 1783. If Versailles had been buzzing during the royal wedding, it practically hummed like a giant gilded beehive in 1774. This was the year Louis, still mild-mannered and still fond of mechanical puzzles, suddenly found himself king. One moment he was a quiet young man who occasionally wished for more time with his lock-picking tools, and the next he was wearing a crown, surrounded by people who bowed deeply every time he blinked. Becoming king was not something he eased into gently. It arrived all at once, like someone handing you the keys to a horse-drawn carriage and saying, "Good luck, don't crash," while the horses galloped off before you even touched the reins. Louis XVI, as he was now known, reportedly whispered, "Protect us, Lord. We are too young to reign," though the precise wording varies. Whether or not he actually said it, the sentiment certainly matched his expression. Governing France was not a simple task. It was more like trying to steer a very large, very old ship whose crew insisted on offering 20 different opinions every time the captain raised a hand. And unfortunately for Louis, the ship had a few holes in it already. France was in debt. Not just a little debt that could be tidied away with creative budgeting, but the kind that made accountants stare at ledgers the way one might stare at an unpleasant medical diagnosis. Taxes were collected unevenly. The poorest people paid the most, while many wealthy groups were exempt altogether. It was the kind of unfair system that had worked for centuries, mostly because no one questioned it loudly enough. But times had changed. The Enlightenment had begun flickering like candles in the minds of many thinkers, and suddenly ideas about fairness, equality, and reason were everywhere. While Louis was adjusting to the heavy responsibility of kingship, something else was happening across the ocean that would tie France into an even deeper knot. The American colonies were trying to break free from Britain. They wrote passionate pamphlets about liberty and independence and threw tea into harbors with great dramatic effect. France, having suffered defeats against Britain in previous wars, saw an opportunity to offer a friendly hand, or perhaps a friendly pile of money. Helping the American Revolution seemed noble, politically advantageous, and deeply satisfying, like finally winning a rematch after a long losing streak. So France sent money, ships, supplies, and soldiers. The Americans cheered, Britain frowned, and the French treasury whimpered quietly in the corner. The war was expensive, spectacularly expensive, and although it eventually led to American independence, it also planted France even deeper into debt. One could imagine the kingdom's finances waving a little white flag sometime around 1781. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette found life as queen both captivating and constraining. She enjoyed the grand balls, the music, the card games, and the fashion. Oh, the fashion! Her hairstyles rose to architectural heights, decorated with feathers, flowers, and, according to rumor, even miniature model ships. Whether or not the ships were real, the point remains. Her style was elaborate enough to make the palace hairdressers reconsider their career choices. People watched her every move, sometimes admiring, sometimes judging, occasionally whispering that perhaps, just perhaps, there were more practical uses for time and money. Though she was far from the kingdom's greatest financial burden, her visible extravagance became a convenient symbol of excess, especially when combined with the lack of an heir. The royal marriage, though friendly, had been slow to produce children, and gossip spread with the efficiency of an early version of social media. Everyone had an opinion, and most of those opinions were unhelpful, but eventually, after medical advice and patience, the couple welcomed their first child in 1778. For a while, this eased some pressure from the public eye. Only some, though. Versailles was not a place where people forgot things easily. While the palace continued its rituals, something very different was happening in Paris. The city was alive with new books, new discussions, and new ideas. Philosophers debated in salons lit by candlelight. Writers argued that society could be improved, perhaps entirely rebuilt, using reason rather than tradition. People began to imagine that titles and privileges might not be sacred laws of nature. The old order, which had stood for centuries, suddenly felt like it was being measured, weighed, and quietly questioned. The Enlightenment did not arrive all at once. It seeped into the culture like water finding cracks in stone. Someone read a pamphlet here. Someone repeated a quote from Rousseau there. Someone else wrote a letter about equality at dinner, and suddenly the conversation spread. People were beginning to ask whether the heavy tax system was fair, why some groups had privileges, others did not, and why the future should look exactly like the past, simply because that was how things had always been done. Louis, earnest and thoughtful, wanted to be a good king. He supported some reforms, tried to adjust tax policies, and appointed financial ministers who proposed excellent ideas that were then promptly rejected by the nobles who found them inconvenient. The king tried again, brought in another minister, and the cycle repeated itself. It was like trying to sweep a room while several people followed behind, dropping sand in artistic patterns. One of his ministers, Jacques Necker, gained immense popularity for suggesting reforms that favored the common people. He was practical, direct, and something of a financial realist. The citizens admired him so much that Louis, perhaps feeling overshadowed, dismissed him more than once. Each dismissal caused public outcry. One could almost imagine Necker sighing deeply as he packed his things again, muttering, "Here we go," while the kingdom braced for another round of protests. By the early 1780s, cracks in the national structure were widening. Bread prices fluctuated with alarming frequency, harvests were unpredictable, and the government could not balance its books without upsetting someone important. The people grumbled. The political thinkers sharpened their arguments. The tension between Versailles and the rest of France grew, quiet at first, subtle, like the soft creak of wood before it breaks. Louis and Marie Antoinette, living at the center of this turning tide, continued performing their roles with grace tinged by uncertainty. The king worked earnestly on reforms, but lacked the forceful decisiveness that the moment demanded. The queen hosted events, supported artists, and tried to make sense of the criticisms swirling around her. And still the idea of change kept spreading. Enlightenment thinkers continued writing, citizens continued learning, conversations continued deepening. It was as though France had begun humming at a new frequency, one that neither king nor queen could control. As 1783 approached, France had helped a revolution succeed overseas while unknowingly nurturing the beginnings of a revolution at home. The kingdom still glittered on the surface, but beneath that surface the ground trembled ever so slightly. Not enough to alarm the court, not yet, but enough that history itself paused, listening carefully. The young king and queen stood at the heart of a nation preparing to shift, though they could not see how far the movement would reach. For now, life at Versailles continued with its grand dinners, polished floors, and formal greetings. But the winds of change had already begun to gather, whispering through halls and alleyways alike, hinting softly that France was moving towards something entirely new. Finances falter, bread vanishes, and the people find their voice. 1787 to 1789. If a kingdom could sigh, France in the late 1780s would have sounded like someone gently deflating a very large, very fancy balloon. The palace at Versailles still sparkled beautifully, and the gardens still performed their daily show of elegant symmetry. But the kingdom beyond the gates was quietly developing a collection of financial troubles big enough to give any treasurer heart palpitations. It was the kind of situation where even the accountants needed accountants. By 1787, France's debts had grown so unwieldy that the mere sight of the national balance sheets could make ministers consider a career in gardening instead. Wars drained the treasury, lavish spending added its own complications, and revenue simply refused to walk in the door with the confidence one might hope for. The system of taxation remained as lopsided as a three-legged table. The ones struggling most were expected to support the whole structure, while wealthier groups continued to enjoy certain exemptions with remarkable enthusiasm. To make matters more dramatic, nature joined the financial misery with great enthusiasm. Unfavorable weather swept across the countryside, resulting in poor harvests, thin grain supplies, and farmers staring at their fields with expressions typically reserved for burnt toast. Bread, the humble and essential companion of nearly every French meal, began rising in price. And not a polite rise either. No, this was the kind of rise that made families glance anxiously at their purses and whisper, "Perhaps we'll just smell the bread today, instead of buying it." When bread becomes scarce in France, one should expect nothing short of a national identity crisis. The French relationship with bread was not merely practical, it carried emotional weight. Bread was comfort, bread was culture, bread was breakfast, lunch, dinner, and everything in between. So when the price surged beyond what ordinary citizens could pay, frustration spread like ripples in a pond. Ripples that soon formed into waves. Inside Versailles, however, the mood remained curiously insulated. The royal family followed their routines, attending ceremonies, meeting ministers, and attempting, in their own ways, to steady the kingdom. Louis XVI, earnest as always, brought in various financial advisors to repair the damage, one after another, like a polite parade of hopeful problem solvers. But every time a brilliant reform was proposed, someone else, usually a noble, a council, or a cluster of high-ranking individuals with strong opinions, found reasons to object. In this way, many excellent solutions were politely escorted out the door before they even had time to unpack. Amid this bureaucratic ballet, Jacques Necker returned to prominence. The Swiss minister, practical and clear-sighted, had a talent for explaining financial matters in ways that made ordinary people nod sympathetically rather than stare blankly. Necker believed in transparency and fairness, ideas that were starting to sound increasingly appealing across France. The citizens adored him, much to the quiet discomfort of those who preferred the old ways of doing things. Necker, recognizing the gravity of the financial crisis, encouraged Louis to summon the Estates General, an assembly that had not been called since 1614. The mere mention of it caused some nobles to blink rapidly, as though someone had just suggested bringing back an old-fashioned trend involving enormous collars. The Estates General was a gathering of representatives from the three traditional orders: the clergy, the nobility, and by far the largest group, everyone else. When the call for the assembly went out, excitement spread. It was as though France had been handed a microphone after a very long silence. People wrote lists of complaints and suggestions for change, known as cahiers de doléances, filling them with their hopes for fairer taxes, better representation, and a little more bread, if possible. By May 1789, representatives from all over the kingdom converged on Versailles. They arrived wearing proper attire, carrying thick stacks of documents and sporting expressions that ranged from hopeful to slightly bewildered. Among them were members of the Third Estate, representing the vast majority of France: merchants, lawyers, farmers, craftsmen, and city dwellers, whose voices had too often been lost beneath centuries of tradition. As the Estates General opened, however, an immediate question disrupted the proceedings. How should they vote? By order, as they had done historically, which gave each estate one vote? Or by head count, which would grant the Third Estate, the majority of the population, a real advantage? The debate crackled with tension, and every argument seemed to circle back to the same point. If voting remained by order, the privileged estates could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1. The Third Estate, aware of its numbers and its growing sense of purpose, pressed for a new system. The privileged estates resisted. Meetings stalled. Tempers simmered. And somewhere in the palace, Louis XVI likely rubbed his temples, wishing perhaps for the simplicity of mechanical locks, which at least obeyed the laws of physics. Eventually, the Third Estate took matters into its own hands. On June 17, 1789, its members declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming the authority to represent the nation. This was not an act of rebellion exactly, but rather an enthusiastic declaration that if no one else wanted to fix the kingdom properly, they were entirely willing to try. A few days later, when members of this newly declared assembly attempted to enter their usual meeting hall, they found the doors locked. Whether this was a scheduling mishap or an intentional disruption is still debated, but either way the message was clear. Their presence was no longer welcome in that room. Undeterred, they relocated to an indoor tennis court nearby, a long hall echoing with past games and present determination. There, standing together beneath the wooden beams, they took an oath. They promised not to disband until France had a new constitution. It was a remarkably solemn pledge, made in a place usually reserved for bouncing balls, rather than shaping political destiny. This tennis court oath, as it became known, marked a turning point. It was symbolic, decisive, and delivered with enough seriousness to make even the dust motes pause politely in midair. The idea that ordinary representatives could demand real reform and insist upon it was groundbreaking. Word spread quickly, citizens were inspired, the air seemed alive with possibility, and perhaps just a hint of nervous anticipation. But while the National Assembly gained momentum, conditions outside continued to worsen. Bread prices stayed high. Fear and uncertainty spread, carried by conversations in marketplaces and whispered worries in crowded dwellings. People felt change approaching, but they did not know what shape it would take or how quickly it would arrive. Louis XVI, caught between advisors offering conflicting recommendations, struggled to find a decisive course. Some urged him to accept the assembly, others encouraged a firmer hand. In the midst of these competing voices, the king remained gentle, hesitant, and deeply aware that whatever decision he made would have far-reaching consequences. As France moved through the late spring of 1789, a subtle but undeniable shift occurred. The people, once distant from political affairs, began to recognize the power of their collective voice. The National Assembly was not simply a group of representatives, it had become a symbol of something larger, something that resonated with citizens who were ready for change. The days grew warmer, tension thickened, and somewhere in the corridors of Versailles, the sound of footsteps echoed with the quiet certainty that the kingdom was reaching a moment of transformation. Bread shortages, financial troubles, and long-standing inequalities had combined into a pressure powerful enough to reshape the future. France was no longer simply drifting through its troubles. It was gathering speed, moving toward a moment when the people themselves would step forward and take the story into their own hands. And though no one could yet see precisely what lay ahead, one thing was clear: the age of quiet acceptance had ended. Something new was stirring, something bold, something that would soon reshape not only the palace, but the entire nation. From the fall of the Bastille to the long road, back to Paris, 1989. The summer of 1789 arrived in France with a kind of expectant tension, as though the air itself was holding a breath waiting for something remarkable to happen. Bread was scarce, tempers were short, and rumors traveled through Paris with the speed of pigeons that had suddenly discovered caffeine. The National Assembly had formed, the king seemed uncertain, and the people sensed that a decisive moment was approaching. Paris was waking up in a new way, and it was not planning to go back to sleep. In June and early July, soldiers began appearing around the edges of the city. Their presence was said to be for order and protection, though many Parisians felt the same way one might feel upon noticing several large cats quietly circling their picnic blanket. It did not seem reassuring. The mood shifted. Conversations in markets became sharper. People glanced over their shoulders a little more often. The thought floated through the city that perhaps the soldiers were not there to keep peace, but to silence the assembly and restore the old authority with a firm hand. At the same time, a beloved figure in the public eye was abruptly dismissed. Jacques Necker, the finance minister who had repeatedly attempted to solve the kingdom's money problems with reason and transparency, was removed from his post. For the people of Paris, this was not just political news. It was personal. Necker felt like someone on their side. The king's decision to dismiss him struck many citizens like a spark in a haystack that was already dry and restless. Crowds gathered. Discussions grew loud. The city felt like a kettle beginning to whistle, and there was no hand ready to lift it from the heat. Citizens armed themselves with whatever they could find. They seized muskets from armories. What they lacked was gunpowder, and they knew exactly where it was stored. The Bastille stood at the eastern edge of Paris, its heavy stone towers rising as a solemn monument of royal authority. People knew it less as a fortress and more as a symbol. It represented a past that limited the freedoms they now hoped to claim. It stored weaponry and gunpowder, and on a sweltering July day, the crowd marched toward it with determination heavy in their steps. The negotiations at the gates began awkwardly. The people insisted on entry, and the governor hesitated. Shots were exchanged. Chaos erupted. Paris was a city already pushed to its edge, and the battle for the Bastille unfolded with a fierce intensity. Hours passed. Smoke filled the sky. When the fortress finally surrendered, the people surged inside. In the aftermath, the governor was captured and killed as the crowd washed through the fortress that had once seemed untouchable. It was July 14th, a date that would echo long after the city swept away the rubble. The fall of the Bastille signaled more than the capture of a building. It was the unmistakable announcement that the people of Paris intended to shape their own destiny. When news reached Versailles, King Louis is said to have asked whether this was a revolt. Someone replied that it was not a revolt, but a revolution. In the days that followed, Paris pulsed with energy. Streets filled with celebration mixed with disbelief. Groups of citizens dug into the stones of the Bastille with bare hands and tools, eager to dismantle the symbol of oppression and perhaps take home a piece of history, the way one might collect a rock from a favorite mountain trail. Meanwhile, the National Assembly gathered strength. It published a declaration promising equality before the law and the protection of basic rights. It was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and it marked a new tone for France. The countryside was not quiet either. Fear and excitement mingled in unpredictable ways. Rumors floated through villages of roaming bands and plots against the people. Panic sometimes set in faster than facts could travel. Peasants stormed manor houses and seized records that had long symbolized feudal obligations. In this swirling atmosphere, the assembly passed measures abolishing those old privileges, hoping to calm the rising unrest. Inside Versailles, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI faced growing pressure with a mixture of confusion and concern. The Queen had become a figure whispered about far beyond the palace walls. Her fashions, her entourage, her perceived distance from the hardships of the people all became subjects of intense scrutiny. Many of the rumors were exaggerated, but the tide of public feeling rarely paused to check accuracy. By October, the hardship of the bread shortage reached a painful peak. Women of the marketplaces who bore the brunt of feeding their families gathered to protest. Their voices were clear and strong. Bread was too expensive. Hunger was too widespread. Something had to change. A gathering formed near the Paris City Hall. It grew and grew. The women marched toward Versailles, through rain and mud with an energy that seemed to rise from the ground itself. They sang, they shouted, they demanded action. What began as a desperate appeal became a movement, so determined that even the palace guards felt its weight. When the crowd reached the palace, they filled the courtyards with their demands. They wanted bread, and they wanted the king to acknowledge the suffering of the people. Louis appeared on a balcony and tried to soothe the crowd with promises. He agreed to distribute grain from the royal reserves and to approve key reforms. Yet the crowd remained unsatisfied. Promises and signatures were not enough anymore. They wanted the royal family to come to Paris where they could be held accountable more directly. As the night deepened, tension thickened along with it. A breach occurred in the early hours of the morning. A furious group forced its way into parts of the palace. Guards were overwhelmed. Some were killed. Marie Antoinette fled through connecting corridors, barely reaching safety. When dawn came, the situation demanded a resolution. The king understood that refusing the crowd was no longer possible. With solemn acceptance, he announced that he would return to Paris. The queen and the children joined him, and so the procession began. The royal family rode in their carriage, surrounded by thousands of citizens, many carrying pikes and banners and singing as the procession trudged through the long road back to the city. It was not a triumphant return. It was a relocation born of pressure and symbolism. As they moved, the people pointed excitedly to wagons filled with flour seized from Versailles storehouses. This was not merely a parade, but a statement. The king would now live among the people. When the group reached Paris, the royal family entered the Tuileries Palace, where they would remain under watchful eyes for years to come. Versailles was left behind empty and silent, the echo of its ceremonies fading into memory. Thus ended the year 1789, a year that opened with economic worry and uncertainty, erupted in fire and determination, and closed with the king living not as a distant ruler, but as a reluctant neighbor to the city that had begun to reshape the world. A kingdom redrawn and a midnight escape interrupted. 1790 to 1791. If someone had visited Paris in 1790 after being away for a few years, they might have paused on a street corner, blinked several times, and wondered quietly whether they had taken the wrong turn somewhere. The city was still Paris, of course, with its familiar stone buildings, its chatter, its energy, and its very determined pigeons. Yet the atmosphere had changed. People spoke more boldly. Assemblies met more often. And the king, once perched safely behind the walls of Versailles, now lived in the Tuileries Palace like a neighbor who had unexpectedly decided to move closer to town. This new arrangement, placing the royal family within reach of the citizens, symbolized a deeper shift. France was trying something unprecedented. It was shaping a constitutional monarchy, a system in which the king would still wear the crown but would not be able to swing it around like a personal scepter of absolute authority. Instead, laws would come from elected representatives, and the king would have to share the spotlight. One could imagine Louis XVI nodding politely at the idea, while quietly missing the comforting predictability of his workshop full of mechanical locks. Despite the uncertainty, the early 1790s brought a period of relative calm. The National Assembly drafted new rules, reorganized administrative districts, and attempted to modernize taxation in ways that felt fairer than before. People hoped, cautiously, that the kingdom might settle into a new rhythm. Even the royal family tried to adapt. They attended civic festivals, posed for public events, and smiled graciously whenever someone mentioned the word progress. Yet beneath these polite gestures simmered unease. Louis XVI tried to accept his reduced authority, but the transition was difficult. He had grown up in a world where kings made decisions and others obeyed. Now every decree required negotiation, discussion, and sometimes a bit of begging. The king often felt cornered, gently but persistently, by a government that expected him to sign documents he did not fully support. Marie Antoinette, meanwhile, found the situation deeply frustrating. She'd spent years cultivating her image at Versailles, only to see it dismantled in the public imagination. The rumors about her continued to flutter around the city like small, persistent birds that refused to fly away, no matter how often she opened a window. She felt trapped, not only politically, but physically. Living under close surveillance in Paris meant no privacy, and certainly no freedom to influence the direction of the kingdom without scrutiny. Inside the Tuileries, the royal family's life had changed dramatically. Gone were the lavish apartments and endless servants. Instead, they found themselves in a palace that felt more like a dignified cage with polished floors. Guards patrolled the corridors. Crowds gathered outside the gates daily. Advisors came and went, each offering warnings, suggestions, or alarming updates about the mood of the people. Louis and Marie Antoinette tried to maintain composure, but the weight of their confinement pressed heavily on them. Around this time, France was also learning that significant political change attracts strong opinions from neighbors. Other European monarchs watched the developments with raised eyebrows. Some frowned with concern, others whispered worries that rebellion might be contagious. Letters circulated between courts. Armies were quietly inspected. The atmosphere across the continent grew tense enough that one could almost imagine ambassadors exchanging polite but very nervous glances at diplomatic dinners. Within France itself, debates intensified. Some citizens wanted reforms to move faster. Others felt the revolution had gone too far already. The National Assembly struggled to satisfy both enthusiasm and caution while managing a state that seemed ready to wobble if pushed even slightly. Through it all, Louis XVI, gentle and hesitant, remained an uneasy figurehead of a turbulent age. By 1791, the royal family had begun to feel not just limited, but endangered. They believed that the changes spiraling around them threatened the safety of the monarchy, and perhaps their own safety as well. Friends abroad urged them to escape. Letters were exchanged late at night. Plans were whispered in corners. The idea took shape quietly. The king and queen would leave Paris under disguise, travel east toward the border, and join loyal forces who could guide them to safety. Once outside the capital, they hoped to negotiate their return and re-establish authority in a more favorable environment. It was a dramatic plan, and perhaps not entirely suited to a king who liked precision mechanisms but disliked sudden action. Still, the pressure was mounting, and the need to act seemed unavoidable. On the evening of June 20th, the royal family dressed in simple clothing intended to make them blend in rather than stand out. Blending in was not something they had much experience with. Marie Antoinette, even in plain attire, still carried herself with the kind of posture that suggested she was accustomed to chandeliers and silk. Louis attempted an unassuming look, but his height and recognizable features made him about as inconspicuous as a tall man trying to hide behind a small potted plant. Nevertheless, they slipped out of the palace with surprising ease. The carriage awaited. Paris, for a brief moment, remained unaware that its royal residence were quietly rolling away into the night. The streets seemed calm. The plan was working. The family settled into the carriage and began the long ride toward Varennes, a small town east of Paris that would decide their fate more decisively than they could ever have imagined. The journey should have been smooth, but life rarely cooperates with such expectations. Delays accumulated, horses lagged, guards miscommunicated. The carriage moved slowly through the countryside, picking up hours of delay that proved critical. Meanwhile, whispers began in Paris by morning. Someone had noticed something. Someone else had confirmed it. Soon the city buzzed like a disturbed hive. The king was gone. In Varennes, the carriage arrived far later than planned. A town official inspected their papers and grew suspicious. There was something familiar about the man before him. Perhaps it was the shape of the face or the calm, slightly uncomfortable posture. Perhaps it was simply intuition. The official looked more closely at the passport, then at the passenger, then again at the passport. Recognition dawned with a quiet but unmistakable intensity. Louis XVI had been discovered. Word spread swiftly. The townspeople gathered. Guards seized control of the situation. The atmosphere shifted from confusion to certainty. The king and his family were escorted out of the carriage and placed under guard. Their escape had ended not at the border, but in a modest French town that now found itself unexpectedly hosting the most important political moment of the year. The journey back to Paris was slow and heavy. The crowds watched in silence or murmured disapproval. No shouts of welcome greeted them. The people felt betrayed. The king had attempted to flee the nation at the very moment he had sworn to guide it. When they re-entered Paris, the mood was not hostile exactly, but cold, distant, and wounded. From this point forward, Louis XVI would no longer be seen as a reluctant partner in reform, but as a figure disconnected from the hopes of the people. Trust dissolved quietly but completely. And in the wake of that shattered trust, the revolutionary spirit of France surged once more, preparing to redefine the future more boldly than before. War, uncertainty, and the fall of the monarchy, 1992. Paris in 1792 had a certain electric quality to it, as though every cobblestone had begun humming softly with anticipation. The city was alert, restless, and just a little dramatic, which was entirely in character. After the king's attempted escape the year before, trust in the monarchy had thinned like overstretched pastry dough. People watched the Tuileries Palace with the same wary curiosity one might reserve for a neighbor who insists everything is fine even while smoke mysteriously billows from their kitchen window. Something felt destined to happen, though no one quite knew what shape it would take. Meanwhile, Europe had also started paying attention. Monarchs across the continent looked at France with the same expression one might use when a friend decides to cut their own hair, as an act of self-discovery. It was brave in theory, risky in practice, and everyone wondered whether it might end badly. The idea that ordinary citizens could limit or remove the power of a king felt unsettling to rulers who preferred their crowns safely attached. Austria and Prussia in particular found the whole situation alarming. They worried about Marie Antoinette, who after all came from the Austrian royal family. They worried about the spread of revolutionary ideas. They worried a great deal. And in politics, worry tends to walk hand in hand with military preparations. Inside France, the National Assembly debated furiously about whether to declare war. Some believed it was necessary, that France must defend the revolution and perhaps even export its ideals. Others argued the army was unprepared, the treasury was empty, and the people were tired enough already. But debates have a way of turning into decisions, and by the spring of 1792, France declared war on Austria. The announcement did not inspire the burst of confident fanfare the government might have desired. The French army was undertrained, under-equipped, and slightly confused about which direction to march. Soldiers deserted, officers argued, supplies vanished mysteriously, probably into the pockets of merchants who believed that if everything was falling apart anyway, they might as well earn a little extra. In short, France was not ready for war, but war had arrived anyway. As early battles unfolded disastrously, whispers spread through Paris that certain generals were not merely incompetent, but possibly treacherous. People wondered if the king himself wanted France to lose so that foreign armies could restore him to full power. These suspicions did not exist in small quantities. They blossomed like wildflowers after rain, each more colorful and imaginative than the last. Then came a proclamation from the Duke of Brunswick, commander of the Prussian forces. He issued a warning that if harm came to the royal family, Paris would suffer. It was meant to intimidate. Instead, it had the same effect as pouring oil on an already blazing fire. Many citizens took the letter as proof that the king was indeed conspiring with foreign powers. The streets buzzed with frustration, fear, and irritation. By summer, the tension had reached a boiling point. The people felt cornered by the threat of invasion, betrayed by their king, and determined to protect the revolution. The Tuileries Palace, where the royal family resided under close watch, became a symbolic target. On August 10th, a vast crowd gathered. Some carried pikes, some carried muskets, some probably carried leftover bread crusts for comfort. The atmosphere was heavy and determined. They marched toward the Tuileries, not with chaos, but with a grim sense of necessity. They believed the monarchy was acting against the nation, and that action must be taken. The Swiss guards assigned to protect the palace stood firm, but were vastly outnumbered. What followed was violent and chaotic. Shots rang out, smoke clouded the air, shouts echoed against the courtyard walls. The guards fought, but were eventually overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Many were killed, and the palace, once a symbol of French royalty, was ripped open by the force of a furious city. During the attack, Louis XVI did not lead troops or issue bold commands. Instead, he walked quietly with his family to the National Assembly seeking protection. The royal family sat waiting in a small room as the assembly debated their fate. It must have been a surreal moment, like attending a meeting about oneself, while pretending not to listen too closely. By the end of the day, the monarchy had effectively collapsed. The king was suspended from power. A new national convention was planned to create a republic. The royal family was transported to the Temple prison, a grim building that resembled a medieval fortress and offered none of the comforts of court life. Outside the prison, Paris felt both powerful and frightened. Victory at the palace had not erased the threat of foreign invasion. In fact, enemy armies were marching closer. Panic spread. People feared that the prisons of Paris were filled with nobles and suspected traitors who might suddenly join the enemy. In early September, the anxiety erupted. Crowds stormed the prisons and carried out rough executions of inmates. It was a horrifying episode born from fear and confusion, a moment when the city lost its sense of balance. Paris awoke afterward, stunned and shaken, unsure how to understand what had happened. Meanwhile, the National Assembly pressed forward. It declared France a republic. Titles were abolished. Former nobles became ordinary citizens whether they liked it or not. And the fate of the king, now simply Louis Capet, loomed before the convention like a giant unanswered question. The events of 1792 had unfolded with the speed of a river after heavy rain. War had arrived, trust had vanished, crowds had overthrown a palace. The monarchy, which had stood for centuries, now fell apart in the hands of a nation determined to redefine itself. France was no longer the kingdom it had once been. It was something new, unsteady but resolute, stepping forward into a future shaped not by royal command, but by the rising voice of its people. And though many challenges waited ahead, the year 1792 had drawn a clear line. The monarchy had ended. A republic had begun. The story of the revolution had entered its most intense chapter. A republic is born, and a king faces his final dawn. 1792 to early 1793. When France declared itself a republic in late 1792, the air in Paris seemed to shimmer with a strange new mixture of pride, uncertainty, and the faint but unmistakable smell of change. The monarchy, that centuries-old structure with its powdered wigs and ceremonial bows, had finally toppled. Citizens walked through the streets with a new sense of ownership over their country, though some also carried the expression of people who had started a complicated project without fully reading the instructions first. The National Convention, the newly elected governing body, met with determined energy. Its members came from many corners of France, and they brought with them enthusiasm, intelligence, and enough disagreements to keep every meeting lively. Some belonged to a more moderate group, often associated with the provinces. Others were part of the Jacobins, the increasingly influential club from Paris, with a flair for bold speeches and slightly alarming certainty. Among the loudest voices were men like Robespierre, whose calm, almost chilly precision commanded attention, and Georges Danton, who spoke with the enthusiasm of someone who had just swallowed a mouthful of hot soup and refused to let it slow him down. And then, of course, there was Jean-Paul Marat, whose newspaper poured out sharp accusations with the regularity of a fountain that someone forgot to turn off. But towering above all debates was one question, so heavy it seemed to sit in the center of the chamber like an elephant politely dressed in Republican colors. What should be done with Louis XVI, or rather Louis Capet, the name he had been assigned in an effort to remind everyone that monarchies were no longer a thing? The idea of putting a king on trial felt strange at first, like placing a mountain in the dock to judge whether it had behaved properly. Yet the convention insisted on due process. Louis was charged with betraying the nation, conspiring with foreign powers, and attempting to undermine the revolution. The evidence was presented. The lawyers argued. Observers watched each word with a mixture of fascination and unease. Louis himself appeared calm, almost detached. It was the composure of a man who had long been overwhelmed by events and had finally accepted the slow gravity of his fate. He insisted that he had never intended harm to his people, but intentions were no longer the deciding factor. The revolution had reached a point where symbols mattered as much as actions, and the symbol of a dethroned king loomed large. As the convention prepared to vote on his sentence, Paris grew unusually quiet. Conversations hushed, as if the entire city were leaning forward to hear the outcome. The vote was long and emotional, each delegate declaring his choice aloud. Some voted for imprisonment or exile, others declared that anything short of death would weaken the Republic. The margins were tight at times, but the final decision was unmistakable. Louis Capet would die. The execution was scheduled for January of 1793. On the morning of the appointed day, the king rose early. Outside, the air was cold, crisp, and solemn. Paris had gathered in great numbers, yet the crowd was not roaring with anger. Instead, it filled the square with the quiet noise of heavy breathing and shifting feet, the kind of subdued anticipation that precedes a moment everyone knows will become history. Louis rode to the scaffold in a closed carriage, accompanied by guards and a priest. The ride was short, but felt stretched by the weight of the moment. He stepped out with dignity. His movements seemed careful, as though he wished to avoid stumbling in front of all of Paris. He climbed the wooden steps and attempted to speak, declaring his innocence and wishing peace for the nation. Drums beat loudly to drown out his final words. Whether this was to silence him or simply to keep order remains a matter of speculation, but either way the sound rolled over the square with steady force. Moments later the blade fell, swift and final. The king who once governed France was no more. News spread quickly through the city. Some people felt relief, others felt sorrow. Many felt stunned, overwhelmed by the knowledge that they were living through an event that would ripple across Europe. And indeed, monarchs everywhere reacted with alarm. If France could execute its king, what might their own subjects begin to imagine? Diplomatic expressions of concern multiplied. Armies shifted uneasily. The continent seemed suddenly aware that revolutions could be catching. Meanwhile, in Paris, the convention pressed forward with its work, but the atmosphere had changed. The elimination of the king had been a decisive act. It was irreversible and immensely symbolic. The Republic now stood on its own, without a monarch to blame for its mistakes or to hide behind when decisions grew difficult. Yet not all threats came from outside. Inside France, tensions simmered. Some citizens supported the Jacobins and the radicals. Others felt the new government was moving too fast or becoming too severe. The execution of Louis deepened these divides. It was as though the nation had taken a deep breath and discovered that the air tasted sharper than before. The Girondins, a more moderate faction, warned that extreme measures would tear the country apart. The Jacobins insisted that firmness was necessary to protect the revolution. Voices rose, speeches grew heated. And in the middle of it all, leaders like Robespierre tried to give the conflict moral shape as they saw it. Beyond the political chambers, the common people faced shortages, rising fear, and constant uncertainty. War with Austria and Prussia continued. French troops, inexperienced but passionate, fought along distant frontiers, while news from the battlefield arrived in uneven trickles. The winter of early 1793 pressed heavily on Paris. Streets felt colder, food lines grew longer, and yet beneath the hardship there was a strange sense of resolve. France had removed its king and declared equality as its guiding principle. Whatever came next, the nation was committed to moving forward even if it stumbled along the way. It was clear now that the revolution had entered a new stage. The Republic had made its boldest decision. The world watched. And within France, the tension between hope and fear pulled tighter with each passing month, setting the stage for the fierce and complicated chapter that was about to unfold. Voices grow sharper, shadows grow longer, and a queen faces her final walk. 1793. The year 1793 drifted into Paris like a heavy fog, wrapping itself around the city with equal parts tension and exhaustion. The king was gone, the Republic was standing, and yet no one felt the sense of calm one might hope for after such an enormous turning point. Instead, the air felt charged, as though the revolution had stepped onto a tightrope and was only now realizing there was no safety net below. Paris breathed a little faster, whispers traveled a little quicker, and politics sharpened like knives, left out overnight in the cold. Within the National Convention, two great factions grew more distinct. On one side stood the Girondins, measured and cautious, preferring debate to force and preferring calm to outbursts. On the other side were the Jacobins, whose speeches were fiery enough to make chandeliers tremble slightly. They championed vigilance, justice, and the absolute necessity of protecting the revolution from its enemies. In the middle sat the rest of the convention, occasionally wondering if switching seats might help them avoid being drawn into yet another intense argument. Hovering over the proceedings was the ever-present voice of Jean-Paul Marat. His newspaper, The Friend of the People, was a daily thunderstorm of accusations, warnings, predictions, and the occasional call for someone to be arrested immediately, if not sooner. Marat wrote with an intensity that might have caused ink bottles to tremble with nervous admiration. His column was small, but his influence was vast, and his name often echoed through the cafes of Paris with both admiration and irritation. Many Parisians revered him as the guardian of the revolution's purity. Others wished, very quietly, that he would perhaps take a short vacation. But Marat was not a man designed for vacations. He carried his convictions like armor and wielded his pen like a small but shockingly effective sword. Even illness could not slow him. His painful skin condition forced him to work from a medicinal bath, but he continued writing with relentless determination, as though the water made him even more difficult to interrupt. Meanwhile, the Girondins, who favored moderation, found themselves increasingly overwhelmed by the energy of the Jacobins. Their concerns about escalating violence went unheard, or worse, were interpreted as disloyalty. The two factions eyed each other across the political chamber, the way rival cats watch one another from opposite rooftops, tails twitching with unspoken challenges. Beyond the convention itself, the public mood grew heavier. France was at war on several fronts. Food shortages continued, and rebellion erupted in the countryside, particularly in the Vendée region, where citizens resisted the new government with fierce determination. The Republic, still young, suddenly found itself juggling foreign invasions, internal uprisings, and political fractures all at once. It was not an easy year to be in charge. It was also not an easy year to be French, in general. And then came the story of Charlotte Corday, a quiet young woman from the Normandy town of Caen, who watched the events of the revolution with increasing heartbreak. She believed that the violence poisoning France had a primary source. That source, in her eyes, was none other than Jean-Paul Marat. She saw him not as a protector of liberty, but as a spark that kept setting dry grass aflame. She believed that if someone removed him from the picture, perhaps peace might return. It was admittedly a dramatic plan, and she approached it with the same calm determination someone might bring to an exceptionally serious household chore. Corday traveled to Paris with a clear intention. She carried a note listing supposed counter-revolutionaries in the Vendée, a pretext for meeting Marat. When she arrived at his home, his attendant explained that he was ill and taking his bath. Unfazed, she insisted she had information he desperately needed for his work. Marat, hearing this, agreed to receive her. Inside the dim room, lit by a single lamp and filled with the steam of the medicinal bath, Marat took her note and began to read. According to witnesses, his response was something like, "They shall be punished," though history leaves enough room for imagination to soften or sharpen the phrasing. At that moment, Charlotte drew a small knife hidden in her clothing and struck. Marat died almost instantly, the water around him turning still. The city erupted. Shock rippled through Paris, through the convention, through the Jacobin Club. Marat was transformed overnight from a man of sharp opinions into a martyr of the revolution. Portraits appeared. Songs were written. Children were named after him. Jacques-Louis David painted him almost saint-like, as though he had died for a cause rather than from the blade of a determined young woman with steady nerves. Charlotte Corday, meanwhile, did not flee. She calmly awaited her arrest, her trial, and her execution. She spoke softly, explaining that she had acted not out of hatred but out of a desperate hope to stop bloodshed. Some called her a monster. Others quietly admired her bravery. Paris, however, was in no mood for nuance, and she met the guillotine with dignity. In the shadow of these events, another figure moved silently toward her fate. Marie Antoinette, once the dazzling Queen of France, now sat imprisoned in the Temple. The years had transformed her. Her hair lost its luster. Her posture remained elegant but carried exhaustion, and her life had shrunk to the confines of a dark stone chamber. Her son was taken from her. Her daughter, though still near, could not erase the ache of separation. The queen, who had once attended balls, now listened to the clatter of guards and the murmurs of distant crowds. By autumn, she was transferred to the conciergerie, the dreaded antechamber of death. Here she faced trial. The accusations against her ranged from financial irresponsibility to political betrayal and other charges far more sensational than factual. She defended herself with quiet dignity, though the verdict had been decided long before the proceedings began. When the morning of her execution arrived, Marie Antoinette climbed into an open cart while crowds filled the streets. She kept her composure, offering no dramatic gestures. Arriving at the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and whispered an apology, a final gesture of grace from a woman who had lived under relentless scrutiny. Her life ended swiftly beneath the blade. Paris stood still for a moment, neither triumphant nor mourning, simply recognizing that another chapter had closed. The monarchy was finished in both symbol and flesh. The revolution had removed its central figures, and the republic, now cleared of its royal shadows, was preparing to march into a new and far more turbulent phase. For though the king and queen were gone, the deeper storm was just beginning. The struggle between factions would intensify. Policies would harden. Fear would sharpen into action. France had walked through fire and now stepped into an even brighter, harsher flame. The shadow of the terror was already forming on the horizon. The Great Terror takes hold, and France holds its breath. 1793 to 1794. The winter of late 1793 settled over Paris with a cold that seemed to seep into walls, boots, and even the pages of newspapers. But despite the chill in the air, the political atmosphere burned hotter than ever. France had transformed into a republic without a king, without a queen, and without any intention of turning back. Yet what lay ahead was far from calm. The revolution, having survived threats from foreign armies and internal uprisings, now turned inward with a tense and fearful gaze, as though suspecting danger in every quiet corner. Across the city, people whispered that France was surrounded by enemies both outside and within. Though French troops were fighting valiantly on the frontiers, the war was far from won. British ships stalked the seas. Prussian and Austrian soldiers pressed from the east. And inside the French countryside, rebellious regions like the Vendée rose fiercely against the new government. It was enough to make even the most confident revolutionaries feel slightly overwhelmed, like balancing too many plates at once and realizing the table was wobbling. In response to this mounting chaos, the National Convention decided that firmer action was needed. They created a small but powerful group called the Committee of Public Safety, which, despite its comforting name, soon became something much more daunting. It consisted of 12 men who were tasked with stabilizing the revolution through whatever measures they deemed necessary. In practice, this meant the authority to arrest, judge, and punish almost anyone suspected of threatening the Republic. Robespierre, once known as a gentle opponent of the death penalty, now stood as one of the committee's most unwavering voices. He spoke with calm conviction, always cloaked in moral certainty. He believed that the Republic must be protected at all costs, and that firmness was a necessary virtue. He had a talent for giving speeches that made people feel simultaneously inspired and slightly nervous, as though their souls were being weighed on a very precise scale. The committee faced an undeniably difficult task. France's borders were aflame with war. Grain was scarce. Counter-revolutionary uprisings left villages ravaged, and the capital, though proud of its revolutionary achievements, trembled with the memory of riots and conspiracies. Something had to be done, the committee argued, and that something soon became known simply as the Terror. Under the laws passed in late 1793, individuals suspected of undermining the revolution could be arrested with little effort. Trials were quick, sometimes lasting minutes rather than hours. The guillotine, once introduced as a humane form of execution, now worked with a speed that startled even those who had approved its use. The constant thud of the blade became a grim rhythm playing in the background of daily life. Yet the terror was not born of cruelty alone. It grew from a genuine fear that the Republic might crumble if vigilance weakened. The committee believed that decisiveness would save the nation. But fear, once released, is a difficult creature to control. Neighbors began to watch neighbors with anxious eyes. Citizens wondered whether a poorly phrased remark might place them on a list. Paranoia drifted through the streets like mist at dawn. Still, the revolutionaries pressed forward, determined to create a new society built on equality and civic virtue. Churches were repurposed, old customs were replaced. A new calendar was introduced with 10-day weeks and renamed months that sounded poetic but left people confused about when to rest. Festivals celebrated liberty and unity with marching bands, elaborate displays, and occasionally papier-mâché mountains, because every political movement, it seems, eventually feels the urge to build a mountain out of something temporary. By early 1794, the Terror reached its most intense phase, later called the Great Terror. The Revolutionary Tribunal accelerated its pace. Accusations multiplied. The number of executions rose dramatically. The guillotine became so busy that the city had to relocate it from one square to another to better accommodate the crowd and the traffic. It was as though Paris was holding its breath while trying not to look downward. Robespierre, though not personally involved in every decision, had become the symbolic heart of the movement. Many revered him as a guardian of republican virtue. Others saw him as dangerously rigid, a man who trusted his own moral compass so completely that he no longer questioned whether he might be walking in circles. Still, he pressed forward. He believed France must be purified of corruption before the Republic could truly flourish. And so the executions continued. Wealthy nobles fell. Former revolutionaries fell. Ordinary citizens fell. Even Georges Danton, once Robespierre's friend and one of the revolution's most charismatic leaders, eventually stood before the tribunal. He had argued that the terror should end, that the Republic had been saved and now needed gentler hands. But the political tide had turned against him. His trial was swift. His final speeches were bold, and when the blade fell, many felt a shiver of foreboding. If a man as influential as Danton could be swept away, who among the revolutionaries could feel truly secure? Yet alongside the solemnity and fear of the terror, life continued in its peculiar, resilient way. Children still played in alleyways. Bakers still opened their shops at dawn, even if the shelves were sometimes sparse. People still argued briskly about politics in cafes, as though ordinary conversation could hold back the thunderclouds gathering above the Republic. By the middle of 1794, France had begun to win victories on the battlefield. Foreign armies retreated. The Vendée uprising weakened. The Republic seemed, at last, to be stabilizing, and with stabilization came a question whispered more and more often. If the crisis was easing, why hadn't the terror eased with it? The committee insisted that virtue required vigilance, but the convention, weary of fear and trembling under Robespierre's increasingly absolute influence, began to suspect that the terror was now feeding itself rather than protecting the nation. It was a dangerous realization, and one that would soon guide France toward another dramatic turning point. The blade that had risen and fallen so many times now cast its shadow upward toward the very leaders who had once directed it. In the shifting political winds of 1794, no one was entirely safe. The Great Terror had reached its height. The next chapter would bring its sudden and decisive end. The fall of Robespierre, the fading of the terror, and a new dawn on the horizon. 1794 to 1799. By the summer of 1794, Paris felt like a city that had been holding its breath for far too long. The Great Terror had swept through streets, courts, and conversations with relentless energy, leaving behind a population that spoke softly and blinked often, as though sunlight itself required caution. The guillotine still stood in the center of public life like a tall, stern reminder that the revolution demanded unwavering loyalty, even as it struggled to decide exactly what loyalty meant. Robespierre, once admired as the Incorruptible, had grown into a figure both respected and feared. His speeches still flowed with serene moral certainty, each word delivered with the calm intensity of a man who believed the Republic could be purified the way a master craftsman polishes a blade. Yet there was something unsettling about the sharpness now. Even his allies, who once nodded eagerly at his every declaration, began exchanging nervous side glances, the type that silently ask, "Is he talking about us now?" The Festival of the Supreme Being in June offered a moment of strange theatrical brilliance. Determined to emphasize civic virtue over old traditions, Robespierre stood atop a man-made mountain dressed in light fabrics that caught the sun just so. Choirs sang, citizens marched, flowers trembled politely in the breeze. It was meant to unite the Republic under a shared moral vision, but observers whispered that Robespierre looked less like a guide and more like a prophet who had begun to believe his own statues before they had even been carved. As weeks passed, fear inside the National Convention deepened. Members worried that Robespierre's next speech might contain their name, or worse, might imply they were insufficiently virtuous. And in the atmosphere of the terror, insufficient virtue was no small matter. It was a potentially life-shortening condition. The breaking point came in late July of 1794. Robespierre addressed the convention with a long and ominous speech hinting at conspirators hiding in the government. He did not name them. This proved to be a spectacular miscalculation. When one accuses everyone, it turns out that everyone tends to take offense. By the next morning, the convention moved swiftly, perhaps faster than it had moved at any previous moment. Voices rose, accusations flew. Someone shouted that tyranny must end. Robespierre tried to respond, but the chamber rejected his attempts to speak. In a stunning turn, he and several of his closest allies were arrested on the spot. Paris held its breath once again. That night, Robespierre was taken to the Hôtel de Ville, where he and his companions attempted to regroup. Confusion filled the dark rooms. Some urged action, others argued for negotiation. In the commotion, a shot rang out. Robespierre was found with his jaw shattered by a bullet. Whether fired by him or by someone else remains an unsolved detail that history politely shrugs at. What is certain is that the man who had commanded the revolution with words now faced it in silence. The next day he was taken to the conciergerie, the same stone chamber through which so many had passed before him. No lengthy trial awaited. The convention had declared him an outlaw. The guillotine, which had performed its grim duty throughout the terror, now awaited its most powerful victim. On the evening of July 28, 1794, Robespierre was placed onto the scaffold. His bandaged jaw prevented any last speech, and the crowd watched quietly as the blade fell. With that single motion, the terror collapsed like a stage set suddenly stripped of its supports. Paris exhaled, long and trembling, as though rediscovering the simple pleasure of breathing without fear. In the months that followed, the Republic softened its edges. The Committee of Public Safety lost its extraordinary power. The prisons slowly emptied. Conversations returned to cafes. People dared to laugh again. Barbers found their customers lingering for idle chatter. Bakers rediscovered the joy of shaping dough without glancing nervously at the door. Yet the revolution did not simply drift into a peaceful ending. New governments rose and fell with the impatience of a theater audience waiting for a more coherent third act. The Directory took charge, a 5-man executive that worked diligently but struggled against corruption, war fatigue, and the ever-inflating expectations of a nation determined to reinvent itself. Across Europe, armies continued to shift like restless shadows, and into this turbulent landscape stepped a young general whose name had begun appearing in newspapers with increasing frequency. Napoleon Bonaparte, sharp-eyed, ambitious, and exceptionally skilled, rose swiftly through the military ranks. France admired victories. Napoleon delivered victories. And any nation that has walked through revolution tends to keep an eye on the person who seems remarkably good at winning battles. By 1799, France found itself yearning for stability, for order, for a leader who could secure the Republic without swinging wildly between extremes. And Napoleon, positioned quietly in the wings, stepped forward just as the stage lights shifted. With a calculated series of moves and the support of key allies, he took power in a moment that felt almost gentle compared to the storms that had come before. Thus, the revolution, which had begun with shouts for liberty and equality, passed into a new era under the guidance of a general who promised strength and clarity. Many felt relief. Others felt suspicion, but all understood that France had reached the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Looking back, the revolution did not provide simple answers or gentle lessons. It was messy, often frightening, filled with courage and mistakes in equal measure. It dismantled an ancient world and stitched together the beginnings of a new one. Ideas born in its streets would travel far, shaping movements from Europe to distant continents. And yet, in the soft quiet of hindsight, one can imagine the revolution not only as a storm, but as a restless dream of a nation discovering its own voice, a dream full of missteps, hopes, stumbles, and soaring declarations, all blending into a single enduring truth, that people, once awakened, carry within them the power to reshape their world. And so the story settles gently here at the edge of a new century, with France standing beneath fresh skies. The noise of the guillotine fades, the cobblestones of Paris cool under the evening air, and somewhere in the calm after the storm, the spirit of the revolution lies still for a moment, before history carries it forward once more.